At first glance, the Pacific coast of California appears unchanged. Waves roll in from the open ocean. Sea fog drifts across the cliffs. And beneath the surface, forests sway slowly with the rhythm of the tides. But these are not forests of wood and leaves. They are forests of kelp. Towering columns of giant kelp rise from the seafloor like underwater redwoods. Some grow more than 30 meters tall, forming dense canopies that ripple just beneath the surface. Sunlight filters through the tangled fronds, casting shifting patterns of gold and green across the water. Within these forests lives one of the most productive ecosystems on Earth. Rockfish drift among the stalks. Crabs crawl along the seafloor. Sea stars cling to the rocks. Harbor seals weave silently through the maze. And for centuries, another animal once floated among the kelp. Small, curious, and constantly grooming its thick brown fur. The sea otter. But for most of California's modern history, this animal was gone. By the early 1900s, sea otters had nearly disappeared from the Pacific coast. For over a century, fur traders hunted them relentlessly. Their pelts were among the most valuable in the world, prized for a unique property. Sea otter fur is the densest of any mammal on Earth, up to 1 million hairs per square inch. That density kept them warm in the icy Pacific waters. But it also made them targets. Ship after ship arrived along the North American coast, harvesting otters wherever they were found. Entire populations were wiped out in a matter of decades. By 1911, sea otters were believed to be extinct across most of their historical range. From Baja California to Alaska, the kelp forests had lost one of their oldest residents. At first, the change went largely unnoticed. The ocean still looked healthy. Kelp forests still waved in the current. Fish still moved through the underwater canopy. But slowly, something began to shift. Because the sea otter had never been just another resident of the kelp forest. It had been something far more important, a keystone predator. In ecology, a keystone species is one whose impact on an ecosystem is disproportionately large compared to its numbers. Remove it, and the entire system can begin to unravel. And along California's coastline, that unraveling was about to begin. The first signs appeared on the seafloor. Sea urchins. Small, spiny creatures that graze constantly on algae and kelp. Under normal conditions, they are part of the ecosystem's balance. Otters hunt them relentlessly, cracking their shells open with stones balanced on their chests. An adult sea otter can eat roughly 25% of its body weight every day. Much of that diet consists of sea urchins. But once the otters were gone, the urchins faced little resistance. Their populations exploded. Millions of them began spreading across the seafloor. At first, the change was subtle. A few more urchins along the rocks. A few more patches where kelp failed to regrow. But over time, the grazing intensified. Urchins do not simply nibble on kelp leaves. They eat the entire plant. They chew through the holdfast, the root-like structure that anchors kelp to the seafloor. Once that holdfast is gone, the entire towering plant drifts away with the current. What remains behind is something ecologists call an urchin barren, a landscape stripped nearly bare. Where forests once stood, the seafloor becomes a carpet of spiny purple and red. Without kelp, countless other species lose their shelter and food. Fish disappear. Crabs decline. The entire web of life begins to thin. And by the mid-20th century, parts of the California coast had begun to transform. Vast stretches of kelp forest were collapsing. In their place, barren underwater deserts spread across the rocky reefs. The change was not immediate. It unfolded slowly over decades. But scientists studying these ecosystems began to notice a pattern. Wherever sea otters remained, kelp forests thrived. Wherever they were absent, the forests struggled. The connection was impossible to ignore. Sea otters were not simply inhabitants of kelp forests. They were guardians of them. By controlling sea urchin populations, they protected the very plants that built the ecosystem. Without otters, the balance tipped. And once that balance tipped too far, recovery became difficult. Because urchin barrens have a strange property. They can persist for years, even decades. Starving urchins survive in a dormant state, waiting for drifting pieces of kelp to pass overhead. When fresh kelp attempts to regrow, the urchins immediately devour it. The forest never gets the chance to return. By the late 20th century, many marine ecologists feared that large portions of California's kelp ecosystems had entered exactly this state, locked in a barren phase, stable but empty. And yet, along a small stretch of California's central coastline, something unexpected had survived. In the waters near Big Sur, a tiny population of sea otters had somehow escaped the hunting fleets of the 1800s. Just a few dozen animals, hidden among the rugged coves and cliffs. For decades, they remained largely unnoticed. But when biologists rediscovered them in 1938, they realized something extraordinary. This small remnant population represented the last surviving southern sea otters on Earth. If they disappeared, the species would vanish entirely from California. Protection efforts began almost immediately. Hunting bans were enforced. Marine conservation programs expanded. And slowly, the population began to grow. But even after decades of protection, sea otters remained concentrated in a relatively small portion of the coast. Large stretches of historical habitat still remained empty, and the kelp forests there continued to struggle. Marine scientists began asking a bold question. What if the otters could return? Not naturally, but with help. What if small groups were carefully relocated into areas where they had been missing for generations? Could the presence of just a few animals begin to restore the balance of the ecosystem? The idea was risky. Sea otters are delicate animals. Relocation efforts had rarely been attempted at scale, and there was no guarantee the animals would stay where they were released. But the stakes were high, because by the early 2000s, California's kelp forests were facing growing pressure. Rising ocean temperatures, coastal development, pollution, and most importantly, exploding sea urchin populations. In some areas, the seafloor had become so densely packed with urchins that divers described it as walking across a living carpet of spikes. Entire kelp forests had vanished, leaving behind silent underwater plains. If something did not change, the ocean forests of California could continue to shrink. And so, a small experimental project began. 40 sea otters, carefully selected, carefully transported, and gently released along a section of California's kelp coast where otters had been missing for generations. At first, the ocean looked exactly the same. The same cold Pacific swells, the same rocky reefs, the same silent fields of sea urchins covering the seafloor. But beneath the surface, a quiet ecological experiment had just begun. And over the next 18 years, the ocean itself would begin to change. When the 40 sea otters first slipped into the cold Pacific waters, nothing about the coastline looked different. The kelp forests that once defined this stretch of California had already faded in many places. Beneath the waves, divers often described the seafloor as eerily empty. Rocks that should have been hidden beneath thick kelp canopies now lay exposed to sunlight. And everywhere there were sea urchins. Purple sea urchins clung to every surface. In some areas, scientists counted more than 50 urchins per square meter of reef, a density high enough to strip any new kelp before it had time to grow. To the untrained eye, these urchins did not look particularly destructive. They moved slowly. Many barely moved at all. But collectively, they formed a powerful ecological force. Urchins graze constantly, using rows of sharp teeth arranged in a structure called Aristotle's lantern. They scrape algae and plant tissue from the rocks beneath them. In balanced ecosystems, this grazing simply trims the forest. But when their numbers explode, the effect becomes something very different. A relentless harvest. Every young kelp shoot becomes a meal. Every regrowing holdfast is chewed away. The forest never recovers. For years, this had been the dominant story along many stretches of the California coast. So when the otters arrived, marine biologists did not expect immediate miracles. Restoration in the ocean rarely happens overnight. Instead, they watched carefully. The first few weeks were quiet. Sea otters are curious animals, but they are also cautious. Newly released individuals spend time exploring their surroundings, learning where food is abundant and where predators might lurk. They drift on their backs between dives, grooming their fur constantly to maintain its insulating structure. Every few minutes, one slips beneath the surface, then returns, something clutched in its paws. Crabs, clams, snails, and increasingly sea urchins. For a sea otter, cracking open a sea urchin is routine. The otter floats on its back, balancing a stone or hard shell on its chest as an anvil. With rapid movements, it smashes the urchin against the tool until the shell splits apart. Inside is a soft mass of roe, rich in nutrients, high in energy. Perfect fuel for an animal that burns calories quickly in cold water. Because sea otters have no thick layer of blubber like whales or seals. Instead, they rely entirely on their fur and their metabolism. To stay warm, they must eat constantly. A typical adult consumes around 5 to 9 kilograms of food every day, which means every otter becomes a persistent hunter. And within weeks of the release, the effect began to appear. Divers conducting routine surveys noticed something subtle. In certain patches of reef, sea urchin numbers were dropping. Not everywhere, just in areas where otters had begun feeding regularly. At first, the reduction was small, but ecological systems often respond to small changes in surprising ways. Because sea urchins have a particular weakness. When predators are present, their behavior changes dramatically. In an urchin barren, where predators are scarce, urchins roam freely across the seafloor. They crawl into open areas and actively graze down any kelp they encounter. But when predators appear, that behavior becomes dangerous. Urchins begin hiding in cracks and crevices. They move less. They feed less. And this behavioral shift can be just as important as the reduction in numbers. Marine ecologists call this phenomenon the ecology of fear. Predators do not only control prey by eating them. They also reshape ecosystems by changing how prey behave. And along California's coast, the returning otters were beginning to trigger exactly that effect. As urchins retreated into hiding, something remarkable began to happen. Tiny kelp sprouts started surviving. These juvenile kelp plants are incredibly vulnerable during their first months of growth. Most never survive long enough to reach maturity in heavily grazed environments. But in areas where urchins had retreated, the young kelp had a chance. The first shoots appeared as small clusters of green blades waving gently in the current. At first, only a few. But kelp grows rapidly. Under ideal conditions, giant kelp can grow more than 30 centimeters per day. Once established, the plants send long, flexible stalks upward through the water column. Gas-filled bladders along their fronds help them float toward the surface, where sunlight is strongest. Over time, these stalks form vertical forests, and those forests change the entire underwater landscape. As the kelp canopy thickens, it begins to slow the movement of waves and currents. Sediment settles, shelter increases, light patterns shift. New habitats appear within the tangled structure. Fish begin to return. Small rockfish hover among the fronds. Juvenile cod find protection in the shadows. Invertebrates attach themselves to the kelp stalks. Even seabirds benefit from the transformation, diving into the dense kelp beds to hunt for fish. But perhaps the most important change occurs on the seafloor. Because as kelp forests recover, the entire energy flow of the ecosystem begins to increase. Kelp forests are among the most productive habitats on Earth. Through photosynthesis, giant kelp captures enormous amounts of carbon and sunlight energy, converting it into living biomass. When pieces of kelp break loose, they drift across the seafloor, feeding a wide variety of animals. Crabs, snails, sea cucumbers. Even deep-sea organisms benefit from drifting kelp that sinks into deeper waters. In essence, kelp forests function as underwater farms. They produce food not just for the animals that live within them, but for entire surrounding ecosystems. And now, slowly, that productivity was beginning to return. Year by year, researchers tracked the changes. They measured urchin density, kelp coverage, fish populations. The results were gradual, but unmistakable. Where otters spent the most time feeding, urchin numbers dropped dramatically. In those same areas, kelp forests began expanding. One patch of reef that had been barren for nearly 2 decades showed a 5-fold increase in kelp density within just several years. The transformation did not occur everywhere. Some areas remained locked in barren conditions. Others experienced mixed results, depending on local conditions and predator presence. But the pattern was becoming clear. A small population of otters was beginning to reshape the ecosystem, not by directly restoring the kelp, but by restoring the balance of predation. The chain reaction looks something like this. Otters reduce urchins. Urchins retreat and graze less. Kelp survives. Forests regrow. And with those forests, an entire community begins rebuilding itself. Yet the most surprising discoveries were still ahead. Because as the kelp forest returned, scientists began noticing changes that extended far beyond the reefs themselves. Changes that reached into fisheries, carbon storage, and even the structure of the coastal food web. Over the next decade and a half, this small group of 40 otters would help trigger one of the most remarkable ecological recoveries ever documented along the Pacific coast. And the full impact of their return was only beginning to unfold. 18 years is not a long time in the life of an ocean. Currents that shape coastlines can persist for centuries. Kelp forests themselves can rise and fall with seasonal cycles that repeat for generations. But sometimes in just a few decades, a single ecological shift can transform an entire system. By the time researchers returned to survey the coastline nearly 2 decades after the release of those 40 sea otters, the change beneath the surface was unmistakable. The reefs that had once been barren were no longer silent. From the surface, long golden ribbons of kelp now floated in thick patches across the water. Beneath them, the seafloor had changed dramatically. Where divers once counted hundreds of purple urchins clustered across the rocks, the numbers had fallen sharply. In some monitored sites, urchin densities dropped by more than 90%. The remaining individuals had retreated deep into cracks and crevices, rarely venturing out into open grazing territory. And in the absence of constant grazing pressure, kelp forests had begun reclaiming the reef. Towering stalks once again stretched upward through the water column. Sunlight filtered through broad blades that rippled gently with each passing wave. In places where nothing had grown for decades, entire underwater forests had returned. But the most remarkable transformation was not simply the return of kelp. It was the return of life. Because kelp forests are not just plants. They are architecture, 3-dimensional habitats that create shelter, food, and complexity for hundreds of species. As the kelp canopy thickened, fish populations surged. Rockfish schools gathered once again in the shaded corridors between kelp stalks. Juvenile fish used the dense fronds as nurseries, protected from larger predators. Crabs and snails returned to graze along the base of the plants. Sea stars slowly reappeared on the rocky substrate. And where prey returned, predators followed. Harbor seals began hunting more frequently within the kelp beds. Seabirds dove repeatedly into the forest canopy, emerging with small fish clasped in their beaks. Even sharks, which often patrol kelp ecosystems in search of prey, became more common along these revitalized reefs. The entire food web was rebuilding itself. But scientists studying the transformation began noticing something even more profound. The recovering kelp forests were not just rebuilding biodiversity. They were also changing how the ecosystem handled carbon. Giant kelp is one of the fastest-growing organisms on Earth. In optimal conditions, it can grow up to half a meter per day. That rapid growth allows kelp forests to capture enormous quantities of carbon dioxide from seawater through photosynthesis. Some of that carbon becomes long-lived biomass within the forest itself. But a large portion eventually breaks away as drifting kelp fragments. These drifting pieces travel across the ocean floor, feeding animals along the way. Some eventually sink into deep offshore waters, where they become buried in marine sediments, effectively locking that carbon away for centuries. Researchers analyzing the restored kelp areas discovered that the return of otters had indirectly boosted the ecosystem's ability to store carbon. By suppressing sea urchin populations, otters allowed kelp forests to expand, and those forests dramatically increased carbon capture along the coastline. In ecological terms, this is known as a trophic cascade, a process where changes at the top of the food web ripple downward through multiple levels of the ecosystem. The sequence looks simple. Predator affects herbivore. Herbivore affects plants. But the consequences can be enormous. In this case, a small marine mammal weighing less than 40 kilograms had triggered a cascade powerful enough to reshape an entire coastal ecosystem. And the story did not end with kelp. Commercial fisheries also began noticing changes. Many species of fish and shellfish rely on kelp forests during part of their life cycle. Juvenile stages often require dense vegetation for protection from predators. Without that shelter, survival rates dropped dramatically. As kelp forests recovered, populations of certain fish species began stabilizing in areas where they had previously declined. Divers monitoring the reefs recorded increasing numbers of rockfish and greenlings. Crab populations also began rebounding in regions where kelp structure had returned. In other words, the reappearance of a single predator had begun restoring not only ecological balance, but economic resources tied to the health of the ocean. Still, the recovery was not perfect. Some sections of coastline remained trapped in persistent urchin barrens. In other places, marine heat waves temporarily weakened kelp growth. Climate change continues to alter ocean temperatures, nutrient availability, and storm patterns along the Pacific coast. The future of California's kelp forests remains uncertain. But the experiment with those 40 otters revealed something crucial. Ecosystems are not always broken beyond repair. Sometimes they are simply missing a key piece. When that piece returns, the system remembers how to rebuild itself. And few species demonstrate this principle more clearly than the sea otter. Because sea otters do not build kelp forests. They do not plant the algae. They do not control ocean temperatures or nutrient cycles. What they do is far simpler. They hunt. They eat. They float through the kelp, cracking open shells and devouring sea urchins. And in doing so, they quietly maintain the balance that allows the forest to exist. It is a reminder of something ecologists have learned again and again. Nature is not held together by plants alone, or by prey species, or by predators. It is held together by relationships. Remove one part of that relationship, and the consequences can ripple outward for decades. Restore it, and life can return in ways that seem almost miraculous. Today, along parts of California's rugged coastline, the ocean forests once again sway beneath the waves. Sunlight dances across drifting kelp blades. Schools of fish glide through the forest corridors. Crabs crawl across the rocky floor. And drifting among the fronds, a small brown figure floats on its back. A sea otter, one of thousands now living along the coast. Each one hunting, each one shaping the ecosystem in quiet ways. And together, they are helping restore a forest that once seemed lost to history. Not by force, not by engineering, but simply by being what they have always been. A keystone in the architecture of